Okay, so Russia. Russia has a very complicated and deep history, which stems mostly from its strange knack of being conquered or not conquered at just the right moment. Russia was always a topic of silent debate amongst Europeans who saw it neither as a European nation nor as an Asian nation. It was sort of not defined, and its otherness is what drives its distinction from European nations. But without further ado, here's the history of Russia, in which we track the development of Russia from a backwards principality to a grand empire, to a short-lived constitutional monarchy, to a communist regime, to one of the most powerful nations on the planet, and then to the current Russian Federation. Now let's make a timeline. Before we dive in, I'd like to set some context, because when we think of Russia, we think of belligerent stereotypical drunks and communists of the Second World. This otherworldliness of Russia does stem from its complicated past. Russia's history begins in about 800 AD when the Kievan Rus was settled by a small group of Crimean nomads. The area we now call Russia had been left more or less vacant after the fall of the Huns and the decline of the Vikings. This is about around the time that Charlemagne is conquering most of Western Europe. The Kievan Rus was an extremely large collection of medieval principalities that existed under the rule of the great prince of Kievan Rus. Because of contesting between the nobles, or boyars, and the grand prince for power over the state, the Kievan Rus was more or less fragmented for hundreds of years. For a while, it seemed like the Kievan Rus was decidedly Byzantine and more of a Middle Eastern power, because in 989, Byzantine Orthodox Christianity was established as the religion of the Kievan Rus. This unity with the Byzantine Empire, though, was shattered with the Mongol invasion of 1237. This was about around the time of the Crusades of Jerusalem. The grandson of Genghis Khan invaded the Kievan Rus and set up a regime similar to that of Alexander the Great in his conquest of the Persian Empire. The Mongols weren't interested in owning the Rus for acclaim, but rather for trading purposes. So the Mongols allowed the Rus to live relatively freely, so long as they pledged subordination to the Great Khan. But that's not to say that the Mongols were peaceful rulers, and eventually, Rus states started to rise up against the Mongols. Eventually, the Principality of Moscow, one of the holdings of the Mongols, was able to establish dominion over the other Slavic principalities by gaining rights to collect taxes from other principalities within the Golden Horde. With the increased influence, the princes of Moscow began to become more and more powerful and also more and more rich. This allowed them to extend power and influence across all of the Slavic principalities, and eventually, Muscovite princes began to be named Grand Princes of the Slavic people. In 1380, the Mongols were defeated at the Grand Battle of the Don River. While this didn't end Tatar rule in Russia, it did weaken the image of the Mongols. After a long succession of defeats of the Mongols, Ivan III came to be named the Grand Prince, and he successfully ended Mongol dominion over the Russian people, further unifying the people of Russia. So, while the Mongols united Moscow and the Russian people, they further separated Russia from the rest of the world. With the fall of the Byzantine Empire, Russians had no allying identity, and instead proclaimed themselves the Third Empire of Rome, which may account for the reason that future Russian autocrats named themselves Tsar, or Russian for Caesar. This made Russians neither European, nor Mongolian, nor Middle Eastern. This stark separation from Europe facilitated development of the harsh autocracy that Russia is famous for. Thanks to the Mongols, though, Russia under Ivan III was considered much more modern than the Western principalities of Europe. The Russian people had much freer economic and social policies than autocratic France or politically fragmented Britain. Which isn't really that surprising, since while Europe was confined by the, quote, Dark Ages, everyone else was experiencing an unprecedented period of growth. So, historians in charge of naming periods. Eurocentrism? I think yes. After Ivan III, rightfully named Ivan the Great, conquered large amounts of land and unified the people of Russia, his grandson, Ivan IV, succeeded him to the throne. Ivan IV was named Ivan the Terrible, mainly for events that took place in the latter half of his reign. Ivan the Terrible centered power around the monarchy, creating a ruthless autocratic rule unprecedented in Russia, taking the title of Tsar Ivan IV. This succession of power was mainly a competition between the power-hungry nobles, whom Ivan saw as a threat and tried to subdue. Ivan IV is responsible for accession of most of Siberian territories and some Swedish territories, but he's also responsible for the establishment of the first secret police force in Russia, something that later rulers will use frequently. At the end of Ivan the Terrible's rule, forces from all surrounding Russia invaded and sliced off large amounts of territory. This induced the Time of Troubles, in which successional struggle in Russia led to the ceding of power to the Romanov family, which would rule for the next 300 years. While the early Romanov dynasty's years were relatively uneventful, the action really began to pick up in 1721, when Peter the Great took the title of emperor, converting the Tsardom of Russia into the Russian Empire. Under Peter, Russia went to reconquer territories lost immediately preceding the Time of Troubles. The Russian Empire now spanned from the edge of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to the Pacific Ocean, making it the largest state in existence at the time. Peter's ultimate goal as Russian emperor was to bring Russia up to speed with enlightened Europe. Because of its inherent isolation from the great powers of the West, Russia had fallen behind in social and political norms. Peter, after touring Western Europe, began a series of reforms that brought Russia to the stage in European affairs. He reformed the army and assumed an absolute position, ruling by divine right like his contemporaries in France. He also made many schools and public academies. Most notably, he moved the Russian capital from Moscow, where it had been for the past 400 years, and placed it in the Finnish Gulf, naming his new town St. Petersburg. Following Peter the Great's reign, Catherine the Great rose to power, becoming the most powerful sovereign in all of Europe at the time. Catherine, like Peter, sought to westernize Russia by ruling with enlightened philosophies and introducing Western institutions like education for the masses. Catherine expanded Russia's borders southward, annexing the Crimea, as well as expanding westward to annex part of Poland, following the partitioning of Poland. By Catherine's death, Russia was a power to be feared, matching in strength and net wealth with Britain and France. About around this time is when the French Revolution breaks out and leaks liberal thought throughout Europe. Also, in a dual revolution, the Industrial Revolution rocks Europe, modernizing all aspects of society. Russia, however, was left out of the liberal and industrial advancements. The many reasons for this boil down to one main factor: conquest. Had it not been for Napoleon's conquests, it is rather unlikely that liberal thought would have left France at all. Napoleon, in conquering Europe, brought France thought with him, introducing liberalism to the bourgeois and leading to the collective overthrowing of the nobility. Among French thought spread in Napoleon's conquests was the new industrial policy spreading from Britain. Napoleon made it to the gates of Moscow, and he almost conquered Russia, but he ultimately failed. Thus, liberal thought and industrial practices were never brought to Russia, and during the Belle Epoque, Russia remained an autocratic regime. In the 1820s, when people were beginning to remember what it was like to not be French, a series of revolutions broke out, seeking to bring down empire and bring about nationalized liberal powers. Aside from the Decembrist Revolution in 1825, Russia experienced absolutely no revolutions or contest against the autocratic rule of the Romanov family. This, in itself, brought about the political backwardness of Russia. While monarchies collapsed in Western Europe and nations like Germany and Italy were born through bloody revolutions and liberal outbreaks, Russia remained locked in the 18th century. The Europeans, though, did not recognize this backwardness at the time. Russia was considered a great power of Europe because of Alexander I's defeat over Napoleon. It wouldn't be until World War I that Russia's backwardness would become apparent. In the meantime, few things changed in Russia. In 1861, Nicholas II abolished serfdom, making almost no changes to the social construct of Russia. In 1880, a series of pogroms purged the Russian Empire of the Jewish population, and in 1905, Russia suffered an embarrassing defeat to the Japanese over Manchuria in the Russo-Japanese Wars. This loss to the Japanese knocked a domino that would lead eventually to the collapse of Imperial Russia. In 1905, many Russians stormed the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg in order to petition the Tsar to make military reforms and bring Russia up to speed with the rest of Europe, once again. This culminated in Bloody Sunday, a massacre in which the Cossacks opened fire on the protesters. This brought about widespread strikes in Europe, which eventually led to Tsar Nicholas II releasing the October Manifesto, which installed a lower Duma into the monarchy. This Duma, though, was relatively weak, and very little changed in Russia as a result of its creation. Political and social change finally came about in the advent of World War I. Russia was dragged into the war as a result of a series of treaties that bound Russia to a responsibility of waging war against Germany and Austria-Hungary in the event that France was invaded. Mobilizing faster than expected, Russia made it to the eastern front of the war and suffered unbelievable losses. The war made it fairly obvious that Russia was miles behind its European contemporaries in terms of industrial strength. Suffering loss after loss, Tsar Alexander II relocated to the front of the war and soon after was forced to abdicate. Alexander Kerensky became president of the provisional government that was installed in succession to the Romanov dynasty, which had finally ended after 300 years of undisrupted control. The provisional government, though, only lasted a couple of months, and was soon overtaken by a coup led by the more radical half of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin recognized the horrors Russia was incurring by participating in World War I, and so to prevent further harm, he negotiated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ceding Poland, Belarus, and parts of Lithuania to Germany. At around the same time, a civil war broke out in Russia as multiple groups, including the White Army Mensheviks, tried to remove the radical Bolsheviks from power. Eventually, the Bolsheviks were able to solidify their power, and Lenin became the leader of the newly communist Russia. In 1921, Lenin established the United Socialist Soviet Republic, the USSR, which was popularly known as the Soviet Union. Lenin instated war communism, which was basically a system of constricting supplies for people at a level at which would only be sensible if a nation were in the middle of a war and conserving resources. This policy was an effort to normalize the wrecked economy of Russia, but just resulted in popular distaste for the government. During the reign of Lenin, social policies in Russia saw incredible transformations. Women were given far more rights than ever before and were considered freer in Russian society than in any other Western power. The government abandoned the policy of subjugating religious minorities, adopting atheism and making it an integral part of the government. This was in an effort to ditch Orthodox religion, which had prevented social advancement for the past 500 years. In order to curb popular revolt against the government, Lenin ended war communism and instituted new economic policy, which allowed Russia to temporarily flourish, giving new wealth to the peasants, called kulaks. Following Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin struggled against Trotsky to gain command of the Soviet Union. Stalin eventually reigned successful and took control of the Soviet Union, beginning one of the harshest and most brutal periods of Russian rule in history. Stalin instituted policies that gave him uncontested rule in Russia, ruling as a totalitarian tyrant over communist Russia. His 5-year plan allowed for economic booms and for industrialization of Russia on scales unseen in history. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a superpower in Europe. His rule, though, is very controversial because while he did prevent Nazi takeover in Europe, his rule saw the death of over 20 million Russian citizens, the encampment and imprisonment of millions of minorities, and the deportation of thousands of citizens. Stalin's brute force against the people became known as the Great Purges, and they made him infamous as a brutal dictatorial sociopath without empathy and without resolve. While Stalin's rule, according to our Western standards, seems absolutely awful, and don't get me wrong, it is, we have to consider the origins of such rule. If you remember back to the 16th century, Ivan the Terrible irrevocably set the standards of incorporating secret police forces and purging the people of minorities. Autocracy had been running rampant in Russian history, and it's wrong to assume that a Fourier revolution can completely convert and trivialize over 800 years of princely or absolute rule. Secularizing the country may have helped lift prohibitions and social change, but political change was a futile effort, as trying to change something so thoroughly integrated into Russian history is nearly impossible. Nevertheless, before 1939, Russia almost fully modernized, and it became one of the richest and most powerful nations in Europe. Later in 1939, Stalin signed the Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany, which in essence prevented either the German Reich or the Soviet Union from taking up arms against each other. Ultimately, this split the eastern spheres of influence for both powers, ceding Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland to Germany, while ceding Belarus, the Ukraine, Bulgaria, Estonia, Lithuania, and other Baltic countries to Russia. For a short time, this pact prevented a large-scale war between the Soviets and the Nazis. On June 22, 1941, though, Hitler broke the Non-Aggression Pact and invaded Soviet borders, quickly reaching Leningrad, previously Petrograd, and Stalingrad. The Nazis nearly captured Moscow, annexing the Volga and Caucasus while laying siege to Leningrad. Initially, the Russian army under Stalin suffered incredible losses to the Nazi forces, but in 1944, the tide of the war changed and Russia pushed off Nazi forces, liberating much of the Ukraine. After relentless opposition, the Red Army captured Berlin in May of 1945, thus ending World War II. With the Nazi threat diminished, the stage was set for global peace. However, conflict between Stalin and the U.S. Henry Truman caused a stark divide to be driven between the United States and Soviet Russia. Mounting tension grew as Soviet Russia began piloting a massive nuclear arms race with the U.S., investing incredible resources into the development of atomic weapons. Because of past atrocities against Russia, like the Napoleonic Wars, World War I and World War II, Russia wanted a line of buffer states to be drawn between Germany and Russia. Truman, however, was more intent on partitioning and weakening Germany. He also distrusted the communist superpower that threatened the integrity of the Western capitalist powers. The subsequent formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, by Truman, marks the beginning of the Cold War, a conflict between the US and Russia which would last 50 years. In retaliation, Stalin piloted the Warsaw Pact. Both of these agreements claimed that an attack against one of the participating nations would be considered an attack on all nations involved in the respective agreements. Much like the treaties that were a precursor to World War I, these agreements bound participating countries to intervene in the event that one was threatened by an outside power. Over the course of the Cold War, as both the Soviet Union and America recognized that the other held significant destructive resources, MAD was put into effect. MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction, stated that if one of the powers used nuclear weapons against the other, a worldwide nuclear war would surely ensue. This policy culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which Soviet forces brought nuclear missiles to communist Cuba in an attempt to get close enough to North America to launch a full-scale attack. Fortunately, the Soviets failed to launch missiles into U.S. territory, and mutually assured destruction was temporarily curbed. The next 30 years saw the slow fragmentation of the Soviet Union. Foreign policy of the Soviets was to assert large-scale spheres of influence and to spread absolute communism. This was initiated at the end of World War II with the capture of Manchuria and the subsequent invasion of China and Afghanistan in 1979. Soviet Russia eventually collapsed in 1992 after a long successional struggle that saw a relatively moderate president assume control and disband communist policies. This saw the establishment of the Russian Federation, which installed a government similar to that of Western powers with a president and a parliamentary system. Some historians claim that the collapse of the Soviet Union was due to continuous economic attack by Reagan, and by relentless military action against the spread of communism. Other theories, though, posit that the Soviet Union was bound to fail eventually. These theories deny the possibility of success for any communist nation. Without distinction in class, you can't have society because, if you think about it, class distinctions are what make nations prosperous. If there's no difference in class, then there's no class consciousness. If there's no class consciousness, there's no incentive to outdo those below you and compete with those above you. If there's no incentive for competition, wealth doesn't build up in pockets. If wealth doesn't build up in pockets, there's no opportunity for industry to develop. Also, if wealth doesn't build up in pockets, then Bert, who earns less than Ernie, has no incentive to outdo Ernie by creating his own enterprise and creating competition. Essentially, without class distinction, there's no economic fluidity. And when it comes right down to it, only a society in which the people are mobile is a functional society. That's why communism is bound to fail, and why eventually the USSR was going to fall apart no matter what. Part of the history of Russia is the development of the three worlds theory. The first world, or the richest of society, are the United States and its allies. The second world is composed of the USSR and its satellite states, mainly nations that were ruled by communist regimes. The third world was comprised of everyone else. One of the main failures of the Second World is that when Western ideals are introduced, the people realize that they are much poorer than the First World. This understanding leads to contest against the government in an effort to amass more wealth for the individual. A theme that reigns constant in world history is that no nation can survive without the consent of the people. While Stalin's Russia was temporarily successful in employing totalitarian tactics that ignored the will of the people, it eventually imploded because of its lack of connection to the world. That, in essence, is a brief history of Russia. Thanks for watching. This has been Zach and Maya Teach, History of Russia.